Welcome to Sacred Heart University's Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series. The Center for Catholic Studies promotes innovative and cutting-edge programs that demonstrate Sacred Heart University's mission rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition as a living reality related to our lives and in the world in which we live. Join us now live from the campus of Sacred Heart University with our host, Dr. Charlie Gillespie.
Welcome to the Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series and the Human Journey Colloquia Series. I'm Professor Charlie Gillespie, and I'm going to be your host today. Sacred Heart University's Center for Catholic Studies presents innovative and cutting-edge programs that demonstrate Sacred Heart University's mission, rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition as an ongoing, living conversation, and led by great thinkers in the Catholic tradition, speaking about important issues in our world today. Our series this spring features nationally and internationally renowned speakers who will be speaking about issues of social and racial and environmental justice. For our program today, I'm honored to present Dr. Nichole Flores, who will be speaking on Our Lady of Guadalupe, the art of solidarity. But first, I'd like to offer a few words to help introduce this very important person in my life to all of you. Dr. Flores has been rightly praised by Olga Segura as, quote, one of the most important theological voices in the Catholic Church today. She holds degrees from Smith College, Yale University, and Boston College, and she is currently an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. At UVA, she teaches some wildly popular courses in religious ethics, Latinx studies, and Catholic studies that investigate faith, politics, and the arts. Listen to just some of her titles. They're fantastic. Slavery and Liberation, a Theological Inquiry. Religion and the Common Good. Ethics and Aesthetics. That one's pretty fantastic in my opinion. Her scholarly work is equally transformative, and she won the prestigious Catherine Maury Lacuna Award from the Catholic Theological Society of America. Once you hear her talk today, I know you will join me in anxiously awaiting Dr. Flores' first book, The Aesthetics of Solidarity, Our Lady of Guadalupe and American Democracy, which is going to be published by Georgetown University Press later this year. But Dr. Flores is not simply some academic interested in democracy. She's an active participant shaping our public discourse. Dr. Flores is a frequent contributor to America Magazine and a sought-after speaker for schools, churches, even the occasional presidential campaign. Those are just some of the many reasons we are so thrilled to welcome her to SHU today. I want to remind our viewers that you can join the conversation with Dr. Flores by adding your questions and comments in the chat here on YouTube. But for now, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Nichole Flores.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillespie. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be virtually present to the community at Sacred Heart University today. And I'm especially honored to be appearing at the invitation of Professor Gillespie, of Dr. Gillespie, who is a graduate of our doctoral program in religious studies at the University of Virginia and was one of the first graduate students I had the honor of teaching when I joined the faculty here in 2015. And I should also mention, I would be remiss to not mention that Dr. Gillespie was one of the most welcoming members of the UVA community to me when I first joined the faculty. He helped me find my footing here as a scholar and as a teacher. And we are just so proud of everything he's doing and teaching and contributing at Sacred Heart University. And so it is especially exciting for me to be able to give back a little bit to both to Sacred Heart and specifically to Dr. Gillespie. And I'm here to chat with all of you today about Our Lady of Guadalupe, the image of the Virgin Mary that Catholics and many others believe appeared to St. Juan Diego on a hill outside of modern-day Mexico City in 1532. That I am speaking with you about Guadalupe on the feast day of St. Patrick is but one more sign of her ubiquity in the life of the church and broader society today. Guadalupe is everywhere. Although Guadalupan devotion originates on the hill called Tepeyac outside of Mexico City, her story and symbol has migrated far beyond Mexico. Guadalupe has gone global, her symbol taking root in cities from Tucson to Paris, from Denver to Rome, from Delano to New York City. Given her global significance, Guadalupe's image is often appropriated to support a broad range of causes, including causes often seen at odds with one another. For example, while her image has been crucial to the plight of poor farm workers in the United States, as depicted in the slide on your screen right now, it has also been leveraged by Banamex, the second largest bank in Mexico, in support of its business. And in the lower corner of this slide, you'll see a plaza at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe that's actually sponsored by Banamex, this bank. So we see immediately these tensions between farm workers advocating for their rights and Banamex, who's invested in making as much money as possible. And they both lay claim to the image of La Virgen de Guadalupe. In the United States today, Guadalupe's image has recently been seen at the March for Life and other pro-life marches, even if it is still leveraged as an image of feminist empowerment. So we see in the upper corner here, and sadly, the image of Guadalupe got cropped out as I was putting the slide together, but her image is a increasingly prominent image at the March for Life. Any of you who have been or who have watched coverage of the march know that that is increasingly the case, even as her image continues to be interpreted as a symbol of empowerment, specifically for Mexican American and Latina women or women with brown skin, as a sign of our dignity and our claim to equal respect in our society. In light of these diverse appropriations of her symbol, what does Guadalupe mean for us today? How ought we make sense of Guadalupe's place in our common life, our culture, our economics, our politics? In short, what are the interpretive politics for the symbol that has been so significant in the lives of Catholics around the world? To address these questions, today I want to lay out for you what I call a political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego, or a theological and aesthetic framework for interpreting Guadalupe's meaning and its significance for our 21st century democracy in the US. First, some background on Our Lady of Guadalupe and her appearance to Juan Diego. The encounter between La Virgen de Guadalupe and Juan Diego is said to have taken place in 1531-1532 approximately, though the earliest known written account was recorded more than a century later in 1648. Juan Diego, as the story goes, is drawn to the hill of Tepeyac, which he calls the place of flowers, or heaven in Nahuatl. Juan Diego finds Guadalupe on Tepeyac. Guadalupe asks Juan Diego to petition Bishop Juan de Zumárraga to build a basilica in her honor at Tepeyac. Juan Diego demurs, feeling unworthy to petition the bishop due to his marginal status in colonial society. Actually, interestingly, in the accounts of the Guadalupe narrative, Juan Diego actually refers to himself as the excrement of the people, or the people's dung. He sees himself as not just a lowly person, but a person who is waste. He's a waste of a human, and that is really remarkable in this story and important to keep in mind. Nevertheless, Guadalupe persists, convincing Juan Diego that it is he, and not a person of higher social status, nor one with more influence, who she wants to appear before the bishop on her behalf. Juan Diego, after unsuccessful attempts to persuade the bishop to build Guadalupe's basilica, appears before him a final time. This time, Guadalupe sends Juan Diego with a tilma, or a cloak, full of roses grown in the frozen December earth of Tepeyac. When Juan Diego unfurls his lapful to present the flowers to the bishop, a brilliant image of La Virgen de Guadalupe appears embedded in the garments. Converted by the splendid image, Bishop Zumárraga believes Juan Diego's story and grants his request to build a basilica dedicated to Guadalupe. And if we can advance the slide, I have a couple of images of the basilica. First, in the larger image, we see the image of the tilma or the cloak that depicts Guadalupe, and this is on display at the basilica built in her honor in Mexico City. And it's visited by throngs of people each year, including thousands of visitors on her feast day in December. The image in the upper corner is a painting of Juan Diego at the basilica. And in the lower corner, we see an image of crosses and rosaries that are emblazoned with Guadalupe's image that are for sale by various vendors, both on the grounds of the basilica, but also immediately outside of the basilica, showing again the tension between the religious devotion to Guadalupe, but also the economic commodification of her symbol and the way that it's being used in various contexts to sell different products or to make different political statements, etc. Political theology, I argue, is particularly amenable or open to investigating the multivalent significance of Guadalupe's symbol, which is simultaneously Catholic and indigenous, personal and universal, ethical and political. I argue that any useful political theology of Guadalupe ought to be shaped by her relationship with Juan Diego, who sees himself as a poor, ordinary person, the dung of the people, whom she selects specifically to advocate for her before the colonial church authorities. The encounter between Guadalupe and Juan Diego articulates a relational ethics in which Juan Diego is empowered by his encounter with Guadalupe's beauty, or what is known as flower and song in Nahuatl, or flor y canto in Spanish. Some of you might have seen the hymnal in many parishes called Flor y Canto, and this is where that reference comes from. And to recognize his dignity and personhood, which are constituted both by autonomy and relationality, so both by independence as well as relationship. Beyond his personal experience of conversion, the aesthetic encounter with Guadalupe participates in Juan Diego's empowerment and change in status vis-a-vis colonial ecclesial power structures. In light of Juan Diego's experience of empowerment, I anchor this political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego in the Magnificat, showing how this relationship participates in bringing down the powerful from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. Go ahead and advance the slide, please. And there is the passage from Luke for you to contemplate. A recurring question in Guadalupan theological interpretation is whether the symbol is essentially one of private devotion or directing the devotee toward Jesus, the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary, or one of larger political and cultural significance, or exerting power within various public realms. The question itself assumes a dichotomous view of the relationship between religion and public life that is characteristic of modernity. It is this same dichotomous worldview that enforces a strict separation between the domestic and public spheres, relegating religious devotion to the private and domestic sphere. This is particularly prevalent in feminized aspects of religious and theological traditions, including Catholic Marian devotion. Devotion to Mary as Mother of God, including Guadalupe, is understood as a private matter carried out in a domestic context. But recent social scientific studies, particularly of the sociology of religions and through the use of ethnographic methods, have demonstrated the inextricably public and political dimensions of personal and ecclesial Marian devotions. The feminist axiom, the personal is political, helps illustrate the inherently public dimensions of Marian devotion. Jeanette Rodriguez, who's a scholar of religion, finds that Guadalupe has strong personal significance for women. In interviews with women, with Mexican-American women, they describe Guadalupe as a reflection of both their faith in God and their Mexican-American identity. The women who participated in Rodriguez's study are not involved in political activism, even in Mexican-American social justice organizations. Rodriguez speculates that this kind of activity might not be encouraged or supported among the young mothers with whom she spoke in her study. Even so, the study participants describe how Guadalupe helps them respond to struggles in their social world, especially those that they experience as mothers. Consider what happened to Mary, writes Rodriguez. Her son was crucified, suffered, and died, but he rose from the dead. Therefore, things will be well, despite the torment, pain, alienation, loneliness, confusion, and suffering. Guadalupe understands the pain they experience as mothers who are marginalized in society due to their ethnicity, culture, and gender, and even their religion. It is in this identification that Guadalupe's political significance to these women becomes evident. The image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is a symbol of power for a population in a seemingly powerless situation, says Rodriguez. Guadalupe is a source of empowerment that helps women to survive amid challenging political circumstances. If the personal is political, then the empowerment of Mexican American women in the context of their everyday lives is already an act of political resistance to social, economic, and political structures that undermine their dignity. Maria del Socorro Castaneda Liles studies the view of Guadalupe among Mexican women living in the United States, and her study yields similar findings. When she asks one of her study participants, who's named Esperanza, whether Guadalupe is a Mexican cultural symbol or a Catholic religious symbol, Esperanza responds by grappling productively with Guadalupe's multidimensional significance in her life. She responded to her interviewer, could you please do me a favor and remove the milk from the coffee you're drinking? The interviewer looks down and says, I cannot do that. It's impossible, for the milk and the coffee are mixed together. She responds to her interviewer, exactly, mija. Mexico is like coffee with milk. You cannot separate the Virgin of Guadalupe from religion and culture. It's all mixed together. Esperanza gives an apt illustration of Guadalupe's manifestation in both religion and culture. While it can be helpful, perhaps, to make important analytical distinctions between religion and culture for the sake of conceptual clarity, the lived expression of religion and culture is mutually constitutive. Guadalupe is simultaneously sacred and secular, religious and cultural, personal and political. Esperanza's insight also gestures to Guadalupe's multidimensional meaning in the context of 21st century democracy. Guadalupe's formative religious and cultural influence is not something that Mexican Americans simply abandon when they interact with matters of public significance. While Castaneda Liles study participants describe Guadalupe's personal and religious significance in their lives, their responses to the author's questions are inflected by their social, political, and economic context. Whereas Rodriguez and Castaneda Liles emphasize Guadalupe's personal significance for Mexican and Mexican American women, sociologist Alicia Galvez links Guadalupean devotional practices that are carried out in the context of parishes and private homes with direct political action for immigration justice. Galvez investigates the work of parish-based committees or Guadalupe committees in New York City that are united with each other at the diocesan level in an association of Tepeyac, or the Tepeyac Association. Galvez reports that these parish-based committees help preserve domestic devotional practices, such as the display of Guadalupe's image in homes and in church sanctuaries, and the maintenance of parish Guadalupe shrines. Slide, please. And in this image, we see a picture of devotees of Guadalupe gathered at St. Patrick's cathedral in Midtown Manhattan on her feast day, and they're touching the image of Guadalupe here, and they're participating in this feast day processional to Our Lady of Guadalupe that I'm about to describe in more detail. The committees, however, engage in public piety of Guadalupe that has inherent political dimensions. For example, they organize this annual public procession in conjunction with Guadalupe's feast day, making it an act of both religious devotion, which we see here as they reach out to touch the image, and political protest. The procession is rich with religious ritual, but also serves as an explicit political act, as a protest for immigrant justice. Galvez describes the participants in the event as both pilgrims and protesters. She writes, "They kiss images of the Virgin, carry costumes associated with the story of the Virgin's apparition, and they also carry signs asking for immigration reform. They chant, 'Si se puede,' or 'Yes, we can,' just like protesters do at marches, and display both Mexican and US flags." Additionally, the Tepeyac Association organizes the Guadalupe Torch Run, during which a flame is carried by relay runners from the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe on the outskirts of Mexico City all the way to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, arriving at the cathedral during the feast day procession. So it's similar to the Olympic torch run, except it runs from Tepeyac in Mexico City all the way to New York City, including across the border. Such acts of devotion aim to raise public awareness about the Guadalupanos' struggle for full citizenship rights. For example, although the binational relay is a religious pilgrimage, it also possesses a politically transgressive quality, serving as a public demonstration against the separation of families and communities by unjust immigration policies. Guadalupan devotional practices thus enter the public square, articulating rights claims in the idiom of U.S. Latinx popular religious devotion. Galvez findings make explicit all that is implied by Rodriguez and Castaneda Lila's studies of the personal significance of Guadalupe for her devotees, that Guadalupe is inherently personal and political, and influences interactions with the public sphere in both explicit and implicit ways. The multidimensional expressions of public piety are crucial to both religious and devotional practice. A political theology of Guadalupe written in a U.S. context should strive to explicate Guadalupe's political significance for a democracy in the 21st century as it is reflected in these ethnographic studies. Toward offering a framework for interpretation, I will now turn to the ethical and political dimensions of Guadalupe's narrative, particularly her relationship with Juan Diego, as I gestured to at the beginning of the talk. While this relationship is often glossed over in artistic representations of Guadalupe's symbol, it is essential to understanding the symbol's meaning and significance in a democratic society. What is the political significance of Guadalupe for U.S. Latinx communities engaged in liberative political projects within the context of a 21st century U.S. democracy? Theologian Roberto Goizueta addresses this question in his 1999 book, Caminemos con Jesús. In this work, Goizueta provides a theological framework for interpreting the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego. His theological interpretation of their encounter gestures to its ethical dimensions by demonstrating how Guadalupe empowered Juan Diego to recognize his own personhood in a society that attempted to deny his inherent dignity. Catholic ethicist Margaret Farley argues that there are two obligating ethical features of personhood: autonomy and relationality. To treat a human as an end is to respect her autonomous capacity to set her own agenda, rather than to treat her as a mere means to an end by absorbing her into one's own agenda. While human beings have the capacity for self-governance, we are also related to others in intrinsic ways. These relationships are essential to the formation of our identities, necessitating treatment of those with whom we are in relationship not merely as means for accomplishing our own goals, but as ends in themselves and to whom we are responsible. As Farley writes, another way to say all of this is that as persons, we are terminal centers, ends in ourselves, because in some way we both transcend ourselves and yet belong to ourselves. I love that quotation. She's a beautiful writer. Farley's account of personhood illuminates the relational dynamics between Guadalupe and Juan Diego that Goizueta highlights in his interpretation of their encounter. While Guadalupe sees Juan Diego as uniquely capable of conveying her message to Bishop Zumárraga, Juan Diego doubts his own capacity to be heard by those in power. When his first appeal to Zumárraga does not yield a positive outcome, Juan Diego asks Guadalupe to call upon someone with more power to advocate on her behalf. I greatly implore you, my patron, noble lady, my daughter, to entrust one of the high nobles who are recognized, respected, and honored to carry and take your message so that he will be believed. For I am a poor, ordinary man. I am one of the common people, one who is governed. Juan Diego's self-designation as one who is governed is a particularly striking statement when read in light of Farley's articulation of the essential ethical features of personhood. Society does not view him as having the capacity to govern his own life, to make decisions about his own future, and he does not view himself as having that capability either. Guadalupe's request, he believes, is of such great importance that she should entrust it to a powerful person capable of exercising agency in relation to the bishop. Juan Diego's request to send a powerful person to the bishop, along with his denial of his own agency, suggests that he does not regard himself as a political actor capable of confronting the colonial authorities. As Goizueta notes, it is at this moment in the narrative that Guadalupe recognizes and affirms Juan Diego's dignity and agency. In contrast to his own reluctance, Guadalupe refuses to accept his deprecatory self-understanding and instead calls him the dearest of my children, someone capable of acting. Whereas Juan Diego misunderstands himself as an object or tool whose sole value comes from its usefulness, Guadalupe sees affirmation of his full personhood as a necessary aspect of her message. Beyond a mere utilitarian view of Juan Diego as a means for the end of having her basilica built on Tepeyac, Juan Diego's dignity and power are the very contents of her message. She insists that it is necessary for Juan Diego himself to advocate to the bishop on her behalf. Do listen, my youngest child, she says. Be assured that my servant and messengers to whom I entrusted to carry my message and realize my wishes are not for high-ranking people. Rather, it is highly necessary that you yourself be involved and take care of it. It is very much by your hands that my will and wish are to be carried out and accomplished. Guadalupe chooses Juan Diego to be her advocate, not in spite of his lowliness, but because of it. How very gospel of her. Guadalupe's message thus invokes the text of the Magnificat attributed to Mary of Nazareth. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. Lifted up by Guadalupe, Juan Diego becomes aware of his dignity through the acts of discerning goodness through beauty and in revealing truth to power. Goizueta further observes that Guadalupe treats Juan Diego as her equal in the context of their relationship. She does not simply appear to a passive Juan Diego, speaking soothing words and giving him orders that she compels him to obey. She asks him questions. She heeds his responses. She argues with him. She gives him reasons. This dynamic alone would have been a remarkable relational experience for an indigenous person in colonial Mexico. Their encounter transforms Juan Diego's self-understanding from a passive object to an active subject. Next slide, please. Guadalupe reveals to Juan Diego and to the colonial powers his humanity, dignity, and agency. Juan Diego now recognizes himself not as an instrument of society, of the economy, or of the empire, but as an advocate on behalf of Guadalupe and the people whom she adopts as her own. In this way, Juan Diego is fundamentally transformed by his encounter with Guadalupe. And in this image, we see a statue that is at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And we see here Juan Diego presenting his tilma or his cloak with Guadalupe on it to the bishop. And the remarkable thing here is that this image features Juan Diego in it. And as we'll see in the next section, Juan Diego increasingly in depictions of Guadalupe is cut out of the artwork. He's cut out of the picture. And I want to explore a particular mural at a church, at a parish in Denver, Colorado, where this happens, and the political theological implications of that artistic decision. Goizueta's interpretation of the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego helps us to formulate a political theology of their encounter, one that is crucial to how we interpret the symbol and story in the 21st century. This is not a story strictly about personal conversion or conversion of a people, although that is certainly a vital and indispensable dimension of the story. Rather, it is a story of political empowerment of the oppressed within the context of colonization. The encounter made evident Juan Diego's capacity for self-governance and an autonomy that is essential for liberty, as well as his fundamental dignity, which is the foundation to claims of human equality. This empowerment was central to cultivating his agency to confront the colonial ecclesial powers. In this way, the story is relevant in a U.S. democratic context, where the oppressed and marginalized resist the legacies of colonization, slavery, and segregation that still fester in our common life. The ethical dimensions of their relationship are essential for understanding the event's political significance. The Guadalupe symbol can be, and has been, manipulated to support myriad ends, as we saw at the beginning of the talk. Foregrounding the relational encounter between Guadalupe and Juan Diego highlights the symbol's potential to assert a vision of personhood that is amenable to the project of democracy. Now, the mural controversy. The dynamics of the political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego are captured in a mural of the two painted behind the Eucharistic altar of Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Denver, Colorado. Next slide, please. In 1976, Father Jose Lara invited a parishioner at this parish to paint a mural of the Virgin of Guadalupe as a beautiful Chicana, as he said, from North Denver. So he wanted this image of Guadalupe for their church to look like just any woman from their neighborhood. The mural featured an image of Guadalupe's encounter with Juan Diego on Tepeyac. For decades, the mural was the backdrop for the parish's Eucharistic celebrations, as well as its enactment of its robust social justice mission. As one parishioner said, the church was a symbol of a fight for equality, and the mural was its emblem. Then, in 2010, Our Lady of Guadalupe's new pastor ordered that a white wall be built in front of the mural, arguing that the image that we see here of Guadalupe and Juan Diego detracts from the adoration of the Eucharist. Next slide, please. So here we see that the mural has literally been covered up by a white wall. And while Guadalupe is still depicted here and in an image that resembles the tilma at her basilica in Mexico City, we see that Juan Diego has been literally cropped out of the picture. And behind this wall, the mural still exists, but it's been vandalized. It's essentially a broom closet now. And parishioners now call the image Our Lady of the Broom Closet. This decision was upheld to cover the mural with the white wall, was upheld by the Archdiocese of Denver under the leadership then of Archbishop Charles Chaput, who's now in Philadelphia, as many of you know. Monsignor Jorge de los Santos, the vicar of Hispanic ministry of the Archdiocese in 2010, defended the decision to cover the mural, claiming that the religion does not reside in the culture, but in the faith. And this would be in direct contradiction to what we heard earlier from Esperanza, who talked about not being able to extricate the faith from culture, especially in the Mexican context when it concerns Guadalupe. Many parishioners mourn the loss of the mural, citing its importance to Denver's Chicano Catholic community. The mural stood for over 30 years as an inspiring source of devotion, pride, and faith for thousands of parishioners, visitors from across the globe, and the Latinx community, which has struggled for decades for true acceptance and respect by the institutional church. In response, the Archdiocese criticized the parish's efforts to draw public attention to the issue. A salient political theological point has been overlooked in the discourse on this particular political and aesthetic controversy at Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish. The decision to cover the mural with the white wall was both a theological and a political decision, as well as an aesthetic one. It was an assertion of doctrinal orthodoxy, but also an exercise of ecclesial power. Theologically, the move suggested that the Eucharist is an act of communion with Christ, but not with those whom Christ is in relationship, such as his mother or with Juan Diego. It asserts a flattened Eucharistic anthropology that is unable to simultaneously assert Jesus's radical singularity, which theologically, I would argue, must be asserted and affirmed, while also acknowledging the centrality of both synchronic and diachronic relationship in the work of salvation. So the relationships both over time, but also our relationships with people who are around us in our own day and time, and even in our own parish. Politically, the decision to cover the mural served as an affront to the parish's work in Denver's Chicano social justice movement, in which it led calls for social justice during turbulent social times in the mid-20th century. The Archdiocese of Denver reiterates the pattern of Bishop Zumarraga's distrust of Juan Diego's advocacy on behalf of Guadalupe. Covering the mural and thus hiding Juan Diego asserts an implicit political theology of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It renders the symbol to be one of colonial triumph and reinforces a narrative of the conversion of indigenous people to the Catholic Church without demanding a fundamental shift in either civic or ecclesial power dynamics in return. This Guadalupe is easily leveraged, baptizing the capitalist efforts of Banamex or showing support for a pro-life movement whose electoral advocate at this moment, and hopefully this changes soon, is Donald J. Trump, who has guided his administration to separate migrant families and hold migrants and asylum seekers in detention centers with abhorrent conditions. As those of you who follow the news know, this is not an easily solvable problem, and we see that the Biden administration is already struggling to respond to the many dimensions of this problem. But we see that they are also trying to say that it is a fundamental issue of justice that the children who are involved, regardless of how they arrived at the border, are treated with justice. That policy would be more in accord with the political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego, where we see the children arriving at the border as being in the place of Juan Diego, as opposed to being, the lowest of the low or society's dung. The political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego that I've presented here demands an invocation of Guadalupe in the realm of politics that accounts for the presence of the oppressed, especially the colonized. Juan Diego's presence undermines appropriation of the Guadalupe narrative as a means of asserting calls for diversity and reconciliation without an associated call for justice. While a political theology of Guadalupe helps us to see the importance of Guadalupe and calls for justice among Latinx communities, it also gestures to Guadalupe's substantive justice meaning for the life of democracy in the 21st century. By highlighting Juan Diego's transformative moral and political experience on Tepeyac, the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego acknowledges the narrative's essential connection to rectification of power imbalances in both ecclesial and political structures. It situates anyone who has encountered oppression in any dimension as Guadalupe's beloved child, whom she empowers to recognize and embrace the autonomous and relational dimensions of their personhood within the work of justice. From Denver to Charlottesville to New York City, a political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego places her on the side of those who have been subject to unjust legacies of conquest, colonization, slavery, segregation, racism, sexual violence, and unjust deportation. It is a political theology of Magnificat, where Mary's soul is magnified as she bears witness to God's promise to lift up the lowly. And I think I will end there because I want to have plenty of time for questions. So thank you very much for your attention to my words and thinking about this particular matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flores, for that wonderful talk that so richly connected an image and a moment centuries ago to issues that are live, well, and important in our democratic life today. I want to remind our viewers that if you have a question or a comment for Dr. Flores, you can put that in the chat function here on YouTube, and I'll be able to bring those comments into our dialogue today. I want to start, though, Dr. Flores, by asking sort of, how do we think about these symbols that are so important to a community, so intertwined with both faith and culture that we can't separate them, like Esperanza's wonderful image of milk from coffee, and other anxieties about things like cultural appropriation, or how do we allow this mixing and working together? Do you have any thoughts about that, or a way that folks can respond to this wonderful political theology of Juan Diego and Guadalupe and not perhaps be so anxious about crossing those borders?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, in part because one dimension of Guadalupe's symbol that I don't really address in these words, but I have thought a lot about, independent of this talk today, has been the appropriation of the image, especially in capitalist context, to make money for a particular private actor, which is a very complicated thing, especially for a symbol of the church who is supposed to belong to all of us. So I think one way to do that is to, I guess, buy into this political theology of Juan Diego. Juan Diego, when we speak about appropriation, stands in for the person who has been forgotten or who has been relegated to the margins of discourse, even though, in fact, they are central to that discourse. So one example of this that goes beyond the Guadalupe example is the way that Black artists have often been cut out of either conversations or even profits of their own artwork. And we see that this political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego, maybe even the political aesthetics of Guadalupe and Juan Diego, demands that that those artists be given not just credit for what they have done, but have agency in deciding how that work is deployed. Now things get complicated because of any of us who have participated in the creation of artwork in any way know that once you put something out there, in part it becomes a part of a larger community. It's no longer yours alone. The song in my heart right now that I have not yet sung belongs to me, it belongs to my mind. But when I actually, began singing the notes and began expressing myself in that song, it will be received by you in ways that I cannot control. And that's a really challenging, maybe dangerous, but also exciting aspect of the power that art has in our society and our democracy, that it is something that can draw us together. But I think by introducing these ethical considerations of to whom we owe our attention or our solidarity in this case, helps us to navigate those questions.
Thank you. We actually have a question from one of our participants online, and this person, CM, seemed also as sort of struck by the image of the white wall you showed us in Denver as I was. And the question says, Christianity centers marginalized voices, and yet here we are living in a time where white supremacy has usurped that message. How do we avoid the white wall that many have seemed to put up?
That's a great question. And again, one with no easy answers to be brought to the surface here in our limited amount of time together. But I think my thinking about the white wall has really been influenced by my context over the past 4 or 5 years. Actually, as you might have guessed, just from the loving way that I talk about Denver, I'm in Denver, Colorado, and I did my education largely in New England, but now I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was here, although I was out of town, but I did live in Charlottesville in 2017 at the time of the infamous Unite the Right rally that brought a broad range of white supremacists and self-professed neo-Nazis to our town. And I think that's one of the challenges of this past half decade really has been trying to be more honest and incisive about the way that whiteness operates within the US Catholic Church. And I think that Guadalupe, in a certain respect, acts as, I always mispronounce this, a Rorschach test for how whiteness operates, because the way that her symbol is manipulated can easily lose sight of who she was speaking to, the context in which she was speaking, the fact that she appears not as, a white Spanish woman or even just as an Indian woman, but she appears as a woman who is mixed. She appears as a woman with brown skin. And even that aspect of her story, if it's not actually addressed in these conversations about her image or these appropriations of her image, I think there's a real loss there. So one of the delicate issues with the pro-life movement right now, and I want to treat this delicately because I don't mean to dismiss anyone who's robustly committed to the pro-life movement. I know many people who are, and I myself, I don't like the label of pro-life, but I certainly want something. I value every human life, and from conception to natural death. But I think one of the challenges has been confronting the role of whiteness and possibly even white supremacy in certain aspects of the pro-life movement. And I think if we take this political theology of Guadalupe and Juan Diego into the pro-life movement, it interrogates some of those dynamics, and I think might help uh, pro-life people of goodwill to continue to build a broader movement that doesn't only focus on certain uh, white communities or white values or want to advance that, but has a more common good mentality to how we even approach an issue such as abortion, and a very challenging one at that.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got a flood of questions coming in, so I want to share a few more of these with you. From Professor Stiltner here at Sacred Heart, the question is, can you say some more about how the youngest generation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans are drawing inspiration from and interpreting La Virgen de Guadalupe?
That's a great question. And I think some of that is being developed right now, because I think millennial generations, which I'm a very old millennial. I call myself grandma millennial because I was born in 1981. So we are kind of entering our middle of life years now. So we're no longer the younger people. But Gen Z And increasingly, whatever they're going to call the generation that my son is a part of, is having to navigate this uh, their understanding of Guadalupe in real time. And this is happening as increasing numbers, not just of Gen Z or of younger generations, are identifying as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, but as increasing numbers of young Latinos are no longer associating with not just the Catholic Church, but with church in general. And I think this is where this conversation about the relationship between the cultural dimensions of the symbol and the religious ones, as well as the political ones, is going to be really generative. I think I've heard some engagements with Guadalupe from younger people who are now seeing themselves as more involved in secular politics rather than committed to the Catholic Church, that have kind of just treated Guadalupe almost purely as a cultural symbol. And I think that is a bankrupt treatment of Guadalupe. You cannot talk about her image without talking not just about Catholicism, but about the indigenous context from which she comes. And that's complicated. That's a difficult conversation to have. At the same time, I think that there's a temptation by some, and I've already mentioned this, to treat her image as one of pure religious devotion, and that an individual religious devotion, not even the devotion of a community, but the devotion of just a particular person. My son was baptized a couple of weeks ago. I know he's almost 3. I'm a terrible Catholic, but the pandemic happened and he got baptized when he's 3 years old. But the deacon who is performing the baptism, whom we love, he didn't even know that Juan Diego had been canonized in the church. He asked me, who would you like me to mention in the litany? And I mentioned Guadalupe and Juan Diego. And he didn't believe that Juan Diego had been canonized. So all of this to say, to get back to Brian's original wonderful question, I think that one of the potential advantages of this framework for political theology helps us to hold together all of these really different elements. And this is going to be very advantageous for a generation that is trying to reimagine, maybe reconfigure, but also reimagine its relationship with religion, with culture, with the church of its parents, with the church, in some cases, of its grandparents. There are now people who are returning to the Catholic Church, young people whose grandparents were Mexican American Catholics who might not have gone to church with their parents at this point. And Guadalupe, I think, is a really fruitful symbol for helping to navigate those complex tensions in our globalized world.
Speaking of our globalized world, we have another question that is asking for your expansive thoughts on something. We know that Our Lady of Guadalupe is a particularly Mexican and Mexican-American devotion, at least in terms of its geopolitical location. But there have been some controversies lately about other Our Ladies of a particular place. And one of my colleagues in the Catholic Studies program, Professor Bickle, asks, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the Amazon Synod, particularly the controversy related to Our Lady of the Amazon. Do you have any thoughts about the ways in which these images are raising controversies in the church?
Yeah, I think this might even take us beyond Guadalupe in particular, and deeper into some aspects of gender as it relates to the contemporary church situation, because I think that especially the images that have been brought under deeper scrutiny have often been images that have portrayed images of motherhood. And having been a mother now for 3 years, those images now resonate me, whether it's the nursing Mary or any Marys that are either pregnant or are nursing baby Jesus. Those have become the more powerful images for me as a woman, or at least a woman identified person who has given birth and who has nursed a child. I think those images are radically merciful, especially in a context where the women in our culture and women identified people are increasingly trying to to gain back political ground uh, for the significance of motherhood in our society. And I find that there's so much scrutiny drawn to these images, in part because they make people uncomfortable. And it's really fascinating to me because one of the reasons that Our Lady of Guadalupe has been so important to the US pro-life movement is because she appears as pregnant, that she has a black band around her waist, and that is an Aztec symbol that a woman is expecting a child. And that has been used as kind of political leverage for saying, well, she carried her baby to term and therefore everyone should, right? That's the essential argument. And at the same time, uh, there's some squeamishness almost around this understanding of you know what women's bodies actually do and how they actually work. So I said, I'm not sure this works within my framework of attending to the relationship between Guadalupe and Juan Diego, but it might go into this territory of what does it mean that Guadalupe is, and other Marys who have been brought under scrutiny, are not white, are pregnant, or are nursing. How should that be significant to the church? And I think that they play a really crucial role in helping us to better value and understand this particular aspect of humanity that is so often hidden from our sight.
That's such a great answer, because it helps us see that when you expand our thinking about Guadalupe, to be sure to include Juan Diego as part of this larger revelation that includes a whole community. It's a reminder that our relationship to these images are always relational as well as autonomous, the way you laid that out for us, that when we see a symbol that's so politically powerful, it matters that it moves the individual heart, but also that it gathers a community to care about this as well. We have one more question we'll have time to share, which is from another one of my colleagues in Catholic Studies, Professor Plummer. She's wondering a bit more about your Denver example. And as an ethicist and someone who is engaged in public discourse, we'd like to hear more about what happens when we erase powerful symbols, but they seem to become more powerful. What was some of the reaction to this Our Lady of the Broom closet since then? Can you tell us a little bit more about the reaction of the people?
Well, it's been a really challenging issue because the Archdiocese of Denver, both under Chaput, but now under Aquila, really has dug its heels in on this, and is actually, and I wrote about this recently in America Magazine because I interviewed one of the leaders of this particular movement or against this particular trend. The Archdiocese of Denver has continued kind of closing down Latino and Hispanic parishes and trying to consolidate Latino parishes, or traditionally Latino parishes, with white parishes, which again kind of buys back into this white wall image. But then you have I think an increasing political consciousness among the faithful, even among faithful who are just average people. They're not theologians or like academically trained theologians, I should say. In these parishes, they're just people who have been going to the same parish that their relatives built generations ago, specifically for Latinos who were not welcomed into these parishes and into other parishes in Denver, and they want to keep going there. They want to maintain these communities. So it has had this the covering of this mural, while it's just kind of been treated as like a settled issue, it really isn't, and it's manifested itself in increasing scrutiny among Denver's Latino Catholics to how the Archdiocese is treating them in context well beyond this particular parish. What is the diocese's response to Latino the needs of Latino Catholics, whether they be cultural or social or economic, etc. And I don't want to be, I've been really hard on the Archdiocese of Denver here, and I think some of this is due, but they've also tried to cultivate some really good programs. The number of Latino Catholics in Denver has really exploded over the past several decades, and they have a lot of work to do, and they're trying to do it. But kind of making these decisions where is similar to the mural, where the culture is being seen as a problem to solve rather than an opportunity for engagement. That has been really interesting and has led to significant backlash and organizing among Denver's Latinx Catholics.
That's fantastic. We're slowly running out of time, so sadly this will have to be our last question, but I'm sure many members of our audience would love to know, in light of all the wonderful things you shared with us, taught us, and got us curious about to go learn more later, if there's something you're really hoping that our attendees, particularly our Sacred Heart students, take away from your talk today, what's that one thing that you want us to leave with?
I think because we all see images of Guadalupe all over the place, and first of all, I would love you students to notice where you see them. So there's this great Netflix docu-series on Bobby Kennedy that's out right now, RFK. And if you pay attention to that documentary, Guadalupe is all over the place. What does that mean? What does that tell us about Bobby Kennedy's story that we wouldn't otherwise know? So every time you see her image, take note of that, maybe even make a count of it. And then also, when you see Guadalupe without Juan Diego, what does that mean? And that I think is a really important thing. Not that Guadalupe can't be depicted without Juan Diego, but when he's not there, where is he? Is he not there because, there wasn't enough room for him? Did he get cropped out? Was a white wall built over an image that used to have him in it? I think that is a really important question and a great practical question that you can easily ask yourself as you encounter Guadalupe out in the world. And hopefully that will help you to think more deeply about not just her symbol, but other symbols as well of our Catholic tradition. They're so rich and beautiful and complicated that asking about the context of those images and what's there and what isn't, what's in the foreground and what's in the background, I think will always generate good thinking about them.
Dr. Flores, though sadly all the Juan Diegos watching this wonderful presentation have been cropped out of our experience right now, I know they want to spontaneously start applauding you with great thanks for this wonderful presentation and talk. There's so many comments in our chat talking about how grateful folks are for your presence and sharing this wisdom with us. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for joining tonight's program. To learn more, visit sacredheart.edu.